More than 50 years after Neil Armstrong's first step, many people still question whether it ever happened at all. Surveys suggest that younger generations, especially those raised online, are more open to moon hoax claims than their parents or grandparents. Large-scale studies like POLES and CARSI even note a small but measurable shift toward greater conspiracism among younger cohorts, underscoring that doubt has not faded with time. In this documentary, we'll examine polls, the role of TikTok and YouTube, how AI is changing the meaning of evidence, and why independent space science still matters. And the picture these trends reveal is striking. A conspiracy that refuses to die. A conspiracy that refuses to fade has found fertile ground in the digital age. For decades after Apollo, skepticism lingered at the edges of public conversation, often dismissed as eccentric or fringe. But surveys now suggest that younger generations are more open to science-related conspiracies than older groups, and comparisons between data collected in the early 2020s and in recent years indicate a small shift toward higher acceptance of conspiratorial ideas. The persistence of the moon hoax belief is not just a relic of the past. It has reshaped itself to fit new information spaces and new audiences. The narrative dates back to the 1970s, when claims of fabrication surfaced in self-published books and low-budget media, popularized by early authors like Bill Kaysing. These arguments relied on seemingly technical critiques of NASA imagery and mission records, framing the Apollo program as more spectacle than science. At that time, distribution was limited. Circulation depended on paperbacks and late-night television specials. But once the internet arrived, and later social media platforms with algorithm-driven feeds, the distribution model changed completely. Doubt could now spread instantly, with attention-grabbing clips multiplying far faster than any careful rebuttal. This shift is critical for understanding why the conspiracy has such endurance. Earlier generations often described the Apollo landings as moments they witnessed firsthand. Families in 1969 remembered gathering by television sets to see Armstrong take his first steps, an experience so striking it became anchored in memory. For those who lived through it, disbelief feels inconsistent with something they personally observed. Yet younger audiences inherit the event differently. For them, Apollo exists as clips and reposts online, stripped of context, and often presented alongside parody or mashups. The memory is secondhand, mediated by feeds rather than lived accounts, which makes the claim of a hoax easier to imagine as plausible. Generational differences do not end there. Younger cohorts frequently consume stories in short, shareable formats. A video pointing to the flag appearing to ripple in the wind can attract millions of engagements within hours, while a scientist's detailed explanation on the same point rarely appears in recommended feeds. This pattern reflects not just interest but the calculated actions of algorithms. Recommendation systems elevate content that generates heightened responses, outrage, laughter, suspicion, regardless of accuracy. As a result, one click on a short conspiracy video often triggers an automated sequence of similar clips. Within minutes, the viewer's digital space becomes filled with repetition, giving the illusion of broad confirmation. Studies from the POLES and CARSI surveys reinforce this mechanism. They report that respondents more likely to consult social media, or now even generative AI, for science information are also more likely to agree with conspiratorial claims. It is not necessarily that younger people consciously reject evidence, but that the environments in which they gather information are structured to reward engagement over truth. This helps explain why suspicion resurfaces strongly among those without memories of the original broadcasts. The conspiracy is less about reconstructing the past and more about navigating present-day platforms. A deeper factor is trust in institutions. Polling consistently shows that people under 30 express more skepticism toward government agencies, legacy media, and formal authority compared to older respondents. For earlier generations, Apollo symbolized national triumph in the Cold War, a validation of technological progress. For many younger viewers, NASA is just another official source, and official statements are treated with suspicion by default. In that environment, questioning the moon landings does not always emerge as a literal evaluation of evidence. Instead, it reflects an attitude toward authority itself, where skepticism becomes an identity marker, signaling independence from mainstream narratives. The dynamics of online communities strengthen this identity. Within comment sections of conspiracy videos, participants often encourage one another using terms about seeing through lies or waking up, positioning disbelief as a form of insight. Belonging to that community becomes more important than the factual grounding of the claim. This provides a strong social reinforcement loop. The likes, shares, and affirmations matter as much as the content itself. For a young person navigating a broad and often impersonal digital environment, embracing a moon hoax argument can serve as quick membership into a group with shared understanding and mutual support. This resilience illustrates how information abundance paradoxically fuels misinformation. Every Apollo mission detail, from audio transcripts to technical checklists, is publicly accessible. Yet these very archives can be selectively cut into fragments that, separated from context, appear suspicious. A reflection in an astronaut's visor or a quirk of shadow becomes, in a 10-second video, proof of fabrication. The more data exists, the easier it becomes to perform selective edits that favor skepticism. For audiences already primed to distrust institutions, these fragments can appear more compelling than a complete archive. What forms is a paradox. The best documented achievement in space exploration also supplies endless raw material for doubt. Each photograph, each transmission, becomes another potential puzzle piece misused in arguments of forgery. And because conspiracy media often packages these fragments with dramatic captions or soundtracks, they compete less on accuracy and more on emotional impact. The result is a story where conspiracy clips often outperform serious content, engineered to teach or explain. Crucially, the point is not just whether human beings walked on the moon. That matter has long been answered by multiple lines of evidence, including lunar rocks, photographic records, and independent confirmation beyond NASA. The continuing question is why conspiracy remains attractive even when counter-evidence is immediate and overwhelming. The answer lies in how digital ecosystems filter and present knowledge, shaping beliefs less through access to facts and more through repeated framing, viral storytelling, and community validation. In this sense, the moon hoax narrative is less in dispute over past history and more a reflection of current media structures. And that is why the conspiracy survives into the present. It has adapted to every medium it has touched, from paperback books to algorithmic feeds. Each new technology reshapes the texture of its survival. What began as a fringe suspicion in the 1970s has become a recurring presence in the social media diets of millions, reinforced by how platforms themselves measure success. Understanding that shift requires looking closely at how the original Apollo broadcasts were once experienced, and how that legacy now collides with the speed and reach of today's short-form video culture. From television to TikTok. In the late 1960s, television framed the Apollo missions as events of global significance. Families gathered in their living rooms to watch hazy black and white images transmitted across the world. Broadcasters spoke in deliberate tones, and every detail of the coverage reinforced a sense of authority and permanence. The format itself left little room for competing interpretations. There was one broadcast, one narrative, and the moving picture on screen carried its own weight as evidence. For many who experienced it, the impression was less about questioning the images than about absorbing a collective victory for science and human ambition. The contrast with today is stark. The moon landing now reaches younger audiences not through long, uninterrupted broadcasts, but as isolated clips compressed into seconds, shadows, reflections, or close-ups packaged with captions and soundtracks designed to keep viewers from swiping away. What was once presented slowly, with context and commentary, is now consumed in bursts that feel disposable. The result isn't just a shift in aesthetics, but a redefinition of how truth itself registers. Watching a 20-second remix of archival footage makes that event feel like another piece of online ephemera, memorable only until the next video loads. In this condensed format, conspiracy claims are delivered as striking fragments rather than arguments. A hand-drawn circle around a flag's movement, a caption doubting 1969 technology, followed by ominous music. These micro-presentations rarely explain their premise fully, but they don't need to. Their power lies in sparking suspicion quickly and repeatedly. One video may last only 15 seconds, yet its effect endures as viewers advance through dozens of similar examples. Over time, the accumulation itself becomes persuasive, not because of evidence, but because repetition blurs into conviction. The reach of this style is immense. Individual shorts questioning Apollo have attracted millions of views in days. Creators with no background in physics, astronomy, or history regularly command more attention than academics or engineers, because their delivery matches the platform's rhythms better. Feedback loops of likes, comments, duets, and remixes amplify exposure until the same claim surfaces across countless accounts. In this environment, expertise and documentation struggle to compete with content tailored for immediate reaction. Some platforms, TikTok most noticeably, have given rise to entire channels devoted to undermining Apollo. A user might structure a series around "Proof we never went," releasing episode after episode with the same central claim. Audiences return not for rigorous documentation, but for ongoing suspense and entertainment. The personalities themselves become part of the draw, creators using jokes, trending audio, or memes to attach a playful quality to disbelief. And because platforms reward watch time and return visits, sensational speculation often outperforms detailed analysis of spacecraft design or mission planning. This amplification is not random. Studies show that recommendation systems prioritize engagement, and that people who first encounter science topics through social media are more likely to stumble into conspiratorial framings of those very subjects. What starts as curiosity can become a funnel effect. Watch a short clip about a flag seemingly moving in lunar footage, and the platform immediately suggests two more on lighting angles, then another on missing stars. Within minutes, a viewer may have been exposed to a dozen variations of the moon hoax argument without ever seeking it out. What appears to be personal discovery is often just the automated sequence of an algorithm steering attention toward high-engagement content. The implications of this funneling are profound. Archives containing tens of thousands of Apollo photos exist online, yet careful examination of them yields less engagement compared to a provocative 20-second claim. Data confirms this. Conspiracy-themed clips generate more recommendations in feed-based systems than explanatory material, precisely because they provoke stronger emotional participation. A post asserting NASA lied will spark indignation, mockery, and debate simultaneously, fueling comment threads filled with argument and reaction. A breakdown of lunar geology engages fewer emotions and thus circulates less widely. This pattern is not limited to Apollo but is made visible through it, because such an iconic event collides directly with the viral mechanics of today's media. Over time, this daily repetition shifts the public's sense of evidence. In 1969, what people saw on television became part of their lived history. In the present, fragmented clips often outweigh direct instruction from teachers or textbooks because they are encountered casually but frequently. If half a dozen sequential videos challenge Apollo's authenticity, the repetition creates the illusion of consensus even without proof. The authority rests not with the accuracy of claims, but with how often they appear. This shift changes how errors affect credibility. In a solemn television broadcast, A factual mistake or visible inconsistency could disrupt the event's seriousness. In social media contexts, a misleading caption or oversimplified claim is easily absorbed into the stream without undermining the broader message. If one detail is dismissed, viewers can scroll instantly to the next short video making a similar point. The sheer volume creates resilience for the falsehood, while correcting the record requires patience that doesn't match platform incentives. The larger pattern becomes clear. Modern conspiracy content thrives not by producing coherent or well-supported cases, but through speed, recurrence, and emotional impact. Against such tactics, even the most thoroughly documented achievement in human history struggles for visibility. The competition is not balanced because the medium itself gives advantage to claims that trigger reactions quickly. At this point, the story moves beyond the recycling of archival material. Clips interpreting shadows and flags rely on reframing images from the 1960s, but the technological environment is changing again. And the problem grows sharper when so-called evidence need not come from archives at all. It can be designed, altered, or fabricated entirely from scratch. Enter AI. The deepfake era of evidence. For decades, the Apollo footage stood as the most recognizable imagery of space exploration. Astronauts framed by the harsh light of the lunar surface, a flag planted into regolith, the slow-motion descent of human steps across an alien world. But today's digital landscape has introduced a challenge that earlier generations never faced. Advances in generative tools mean that anyone with consumer-level software can quickly produce visuals depicting scenes from the moon that appear impressively real. Where conspiracy theorists of the 1970s imagined elaborate studio sets and hidden budgets, the modern equivalent requires little more than a laptop and a free account. High-quality fakes are far more accessible than before, and harder for casual viewers to distinguish from authentic history. This development has opened a new stage of doubt, one in which original evidence competes against synthetic material designed to feel convincing. Artificial intelligence systems for image and video generation have accelerated this shift. Programs modeled after Mid-Journey can output hyper-detailed stills from a single-sentence prompt, while newer text-to-video systems such as Runway or prototypes like OpenAI's Sora can stitch together entire clips. A request for an astronaut walking under studio lights on a fake lunar set may return a short video complete with lunar dust textures, helmet reflections, and movement that mimics reduced gravity. When fragments like this are shared without explanation, they circulate alongside authentic footage in ways that make origin unclear. Researchers at York University and Simon Fraser University note that consumer tools now produce outputs that once required extensive professional effort, lowering the threshold for convincing but false demonstrations. The situation is further complicated by how these systems occasionally generate hallucinations, producing fabricated details or events that look authoritative but have no factual basis. A scene may include stars visible in the moon's sky, or camera equipment seemingly reflected in a visor, errors that reinforce common conspiracy talking points. For viewers unfamiliar with the term, hallucinations describe the software's tendency to invent details with confidence, even when incorrect. Online, however, these imagined fragments often escape scrutiny, absorbed instead as apparent proof against Apollo. This has changed the tone of conspiracy communities. On Reddit, for instance, side-by-side comparisons circulate, one drawn from actual NASA reels and another generated by AI. Users challenge each other to spot differences, often admitting they cannot. On Discord groups focused on Apollo skepticism, custom clips are traded and modified, treated less like research material and more like collectibles. Even when these snippets last only a few seconds, their effect is disproportionate to their length. A single moment can prompt the thought, if a convincing fake exists now, who's to say the 1969 broadcasts weren't staged too? What once needed pages of argumentative prose is now embedded in a stray video file that merges seamlessly into a broader archive of content. This inversion undermines older rebuttals to the moon hoax claim. For years, historians and scientists explained that the Apollo program could not have been faked with the technology of the 1960s. The effects would have been too difficult to achieve. Today, even though their reasoning remains valid, the point resonates differently. To someone raised on synthetic video streams, the fact that fakes are now routine dilutes the force of the original argument. The barrier between speculation and execution has collapsed, creating a climate where every image, from Apollo photographs to Cold War footage, is met with the same question: is this authentic or machine-made? Fact-checkers now admit the balance of effort lies against them. Detecting manipulated media once meant searching for obvious mistakes, shadows falling at impossible angles, blurred cutouts, or disproportions. But modern generators handle these technical details automatically, leaving little trace of assembly. More concerning, fakes often appear clearer than genuine content. Apollo missions were broadcast using 1960s television cameras, producing images with low resolution and noise. When those grainy clips are compared against today's ultra-high-definition fabrications, the AI version can seem more believable simply because it aligns with modern expectations of photographic quality. What was once a limitation of period equipment is reframed online as evidence of deception. Archivists confront an uneasy paradox. They preserve reels of celluloid film, original negatives, telemetry logs, and lunar samples, each painstakingly cataloged to secure provenance. But when they share authentic scans on modern platforms, their work gains less traction than polished digital counterfeits. In feeds structured around aesthetic impact, flaws such as scratches or unstable contrast, the very markers that establish authenticity, are recast as indicators of fraud. Audiences raised on 4K visuals sometimes view the imperfections of genuine Apollo records as more suspect than the flawlessness of a synthetic clip. Space-skeptical groups exploit this reversal deliberately. Threads emphasize every visual artifact in the NASA archive as supposed proof of manipulation, then juxtapose those with AI videos that display no such anomalies. Their argument is simple: the real looks suspicious, while the fake looks smooth and complete. Viewers without historical context often gravitate toward the polished version. In this way, the narrative snowballs into a broader suggestion. If amateur creators can fabricate a convincing moonwalk today, surely professional governments could have fabricated one in 1969. Beyond public platforms, encrypted communities develop their own ecosystems of disinformation. Members exchange file libraries of custom footage labeled as documentary evidence. Some build multi-minute compositions blending archival clips with AI inserts, layering on subtitles, dramatic music, and professional pacing. Once compiled, these are uploaded widely, sometimes without disclosure of their origins. To a casual viewer scrolling quickly, they appear as credible leaks. The sense of discovery, finding what looks like hidden truth, cements the doubt more firmly, long before experts can intervene. This leaves fact-checkers stretched thin. They must establish both that Apollo records are authentic and that new forgeries are machine-generated. That two-pronged task demands more time and explanation than attention-driven platforms typically allow. While experts explain differences between 16 mm film grain, radiation flicker, and compression artifacts, viewers are already moving to the next short clip seeded with doubt. The imbalance between the ease of creating misinformation and the time required to refute it grows wider each year. A larger irony emerges from this pattern. Decades ago, scientists went to extraordinary lengths to document every aspect of Apollo, preserving lunar rocks, deploying reflectors still used in laser ranging experiments, and securing independent tracking records. International spacecraft, from NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter to India's Chandrayaan missions and China's Chang program, have since photographed Apollo landing sites and rover tracks. These physical, independent confirmations remain immune to video manipulation. Yet on social platforms, they compete directly with artificially generated clips, a context in which credibility is flattened. To many users, a verified scan from NASA's archive and a digital creation output by hobbyists carry equal weight in the same feed. Researchers at CEPR and elsewhere stress that while the risks of synthetic media are real, their existence does not erase the multitude of independent lines of Apollo verification. Moon rocks studied around the world, retroreflectors still functioning, and images captured by other nations' spacecraft form a dense web of evidence that generative AI cannot undo. Yet conspiratorial content thrives precisely because a simulated clip feels immediate and easy to share. For audiences encountering history in fragments, spectacle often eclipses rigor. The lesson for viewers is practical. No single clip, especially one without context, should be treated as proof. Cross-referencing with independent sources, not only NASA's catalogs but also international missions and professional observatories, provides confirmation that fleeting social posts cannot. Treating every striking image as settled truth is precisely the pitfall that makes algorithmic feeds so effective at spreading doubt. The Apollo case illustrates a deeper tension. In an information environment where credible archives and synthetic creations coexist on equal footing, trust becomes a fragile commodity. What conspiracy theorists once speculated about, Hollywood tricks and government collusion, is now simulated casually by software for entertainment or mischief. In such a landscape, the real battle is less about images and more about conviction. Can societies agree on what constitutes reliable evidence when every artifact risks duplication? These pressures shape how audiences think, but they also push different groups in different directions. If the nature of evidence itself feels uncertain, responses to that uncertainty are not the same across generations, cultures, or nations. Some see manufactured footage and grow more skeptical. Others rely instead on independent confirmations and maintain their trust. This divergence raises an important question: who continues to believe in Apollo and who no longer does? Who still believes and who doesn't? In 2025, belief in the moon landings no longer breaks down along simple lines of awareness. It reflects deeper divides across generations, regions, and political cultures. The most visible contrast lies in age. Older adults experienced Apollo as breaking news. For them, it was a defining memory witnessed live, imprinted alongside reports and headlines. Younger audiences, by contrast, do not inherit Apollo as lived event, but as fragments surfaced in feeds and short videos. Older people live the event. Younger people meet it as footage in feeds, and that difference explains part of the generational gap. Surveys conducted between 2021 and 2025, including the POLES and CARSI studies, show that while outright denial of Apollo remains in the single to low double-digit range nationally, younger cohorts are both more willing to say they are unsure about the landings and more open to conspiratorial framings when their first encounter is through social platforms or generative AI. The disparity is less about knowledge deficits than about how credibility is established in different information environments. Geography adds another layer. In cities, people are more likely to have access to science museums, planetariums, and university events that give Apollo a physical presence through artifacts and exhibitions. In those settings, the missions appear substantial, grounded in objects one can examine directly. In rural regions, far from such institutions, Apollo often reaches people only through screens. There, the absence of local reinforcement leaves narratives more vulnerable to the sway of online reinterpretation. The pattern is not strictly about education level, but about infrastructure, whether opportunities exist to encounter Apollo as part of the physical world. Politics intersects with this divide inside the United States. Groups that already distrust government agencies are more apt to frame Apollo as fabrication, consistent with their broader worldview in which official accounts are assumed suspect. Among audiences who place greater weight on established institutions, disbelief remains comparatively rare, with Apollo accepted as consistent with the technical achievements of its era. The lunar landings become one more symbolic stage for competing interpretations of authority, aligning the conspiracy less with scientific evidence itself than with cultural identity and political leanings. Outside U.S. borders, the landscape looks markedly different. In Western Europe, Apollo tends to be framed as a collective human accomplishment more than a nationalist project, and skepticism plays a smaller role in public discourse. Eastern Europe adds still another context. Cultural memory of Soviet monitoring during the Cold War sustains belief, because the USSR closely tracked and would have exposed a hoax. For many in the region, Soviet surveillance during that era functions as an independent verification of America's success. Where U.S. debates revolve around suspicion toward domestic authority, Eastern Europe often treats Apollo as doubly confirmed, validated by a historic rival. In Asia, current space programs shape perceptions in their own ways. India's Chandrayaan-3 and China's Chang'e missions have returned direct observations of the Apollo landing sites, detecting disturbance patterns and confirming human activity. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has long-imaged descent stages still resting on the surface, and Apollo's retroreflectors continue to be used globally for laser ranging experiments. These tangible points of evidence serve as robust, independent confirmations that AI fakes or viral shorts cannot counter. In India and China, the existence of this data dovetails with pride in national space programs, reinforcing rather than weakening trust. For many citizens, Apollo is not a distant Cold War story, but the first chapter in an ongoing international effort that now includes their own nations. This contrast between the United States and countries like India and China is striking. Poll data indicates that U.S. youth are more likely than their foreign counterparts to express suspicion about Apollo, while Indian and Chinese youth, raised amid visible domestic lunar achievements, maintain stronger confidence. What looks superficially like a paradox, greater belief abroad than in the United States, makes sense once cultural framing is considered. In new space powers, embracing Apollo aligns with national identity and validates present achievements. In the United States, doubt functions as a gesture of defiance toward political and institutional authority. Generational contrasts within countries further underscore that space programs and civic trust shape belief differently depending on context. In India, younger generations are more certain about Apollo than older ones, a reversal born from experiencing their nation's accelerating space accomplishments firsthand. In Europe and North America, the generational line tilts opposite. Youth, lacking lived memory and immersed in algorithmic content, are more open to doubt. Access to native spaceflight successes, or the absence of them, reshapes the plausibility of lunar travel in the past. Education systems amplify these tendencies, where national curricula teach Apollo in depth with technical and geopolitical framing. Students retain a clearer sense of its context and credibility. Where Apollo is only briefly mentioned as part of a broader Cold War unit, the reference is less durable, and competing media stories slip in more easily. The difference between sustained instruction and cursory acknowledgement helps explain why uncertainty manifests unevenly across countries and classrooms. Patterns of media trust complete the equation. In societies where mainstream journalism retains authority, Apollo skepticism recedes, because public reliance on news sources reinforces the sense that the evidence is continuous and transparent. In places where the press is regarded with suspicion, Apollo becomes one more reference point in a broader narrative of manipulation and hidden truths. In such environments, even the best documented missions of the 20th century are vulnerable to reinterpretation. Belief in Apollo thus stands as a proxy for how societies process institutional information more generally. The implications extend well beyond the question of lunar history. For younger Americans who engage first with Apollo through conspiratorial shorts, the habits of suspicion transfer readily into other scientific topics. A worldview that doubts lunar missions tends to carry similar doubts about vaccines, climate models, or election processes. Internationally, the inverse can be seen. Confidence in Apollo reinforces confidence in science more broadly, especially in nations tying their own progress to the space frontier. What may appear to be a debate about history textbooks is in fact an early signal of broader public orientations toward expertise and authority. So, the most surprising finding is that belief in Apollo often measures higher in emerging space powers than in the United States itself. This inversion reinforces that doubt is not inevitable with time or distance, but grows strongest where mistrust and fragmented information systems overlap. Where nations achieve new evidence and visibly extend exploration, the reality of Apollo is reaffirmed. Where fragmentation dominates, disbelief replicates. The divide is not permanent, but it conditions how each society frames both past and future missions. As the divide widens, institutions in charge of space storytelling face new challenges. Apollo's legacy used to rest on communal broadcasts. Now, it competes in fragmented feeds where repetition outweighs documentation. That reality brings new pressure to the institutions most associated with Apollo in the first place, pressure that shapes how they communicate, how they defend their record, and how they attempt to reach younger audiences already skeptical of official narratives. The next challenge is whether those institutions can adapt quickly enough to compete on the same digital terrain where doubt has spent years gaining ground. NASA's 2025 Counteroffensive. In 2025, NASA faces a communication challenge that looks very different from the era of Apollo. The agency once depended on network television, press conferences, and printed photographs to build trust. Today, it must contend with digital ecosystems where manipulated content circulates rapidly and even authentic footage is questioned. In response, NASA has begun a counteroffensive aimed at meeting the public where doubt has gained ground. Rather than limiting itself to official announcements and static archives, the agency has widened its outreach across social platforms and expanded the public record available online. The strategy is not about abandoning formality, but about embedding Apollo's evidence into the digital spaces where misinformation spreads most easily. A central piece of this new approach is accessibility. NASA has accelerated digitization of Apollo-era records, flight transcripts, design diagrams, and high-resolution photographs that were once confined to research libraries or cumbersome disks. The digitized collections are now searchable and free to the public, often paired with interactive interfaces that make exploration direct and simple. Visitors can examine frame-by-frame video reels, pore over mission logs, or compare multiple photo sequences, encountering not highlights but the raw material of the program. The idea is straightforward. Transparency is strengthened not by selected images but by unedited detail. In a climate where synthetic content blurs perception, supplying more original context helps viewers see the volume and consistency behind Apollo. Independent confirmations, such as photographs from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and international probes like Chandrayaan and Chang, reinforce this record, offering multiple lines of evidence that no isolated hoax theory explains away. Alongside archives, NASA has expanded its presence across contemporary platforms. The agency produces clips, animations, and Q&As designed for short-form feeds, distributing them on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. Rather than imitating influencer culture outright, the material mirrors platform formats. Concise videos that address common questions and myths in the same language conspiracy shorts often used to spread doubt. Some explain why stars are not visible in lunar photography. Others show how lunar soil scatters differently than dust on Earth. While the tone is simpler than technical briefings, the content carries weight by connecting audience questions directly to scientific explanation. NASA's intent is not to abandon rigor, but to adapt communication style to the way people already process information. Widening access also involves partnerships with educators. NASA develops segment-sized teaching modules that can circulate across classrooms and social media simultaneously. These modules, short, clear demonstrations of physical principles, explain details like the behavior of shadows during descent or the mechanics of the lunar module. The emphasis is on aligning explanations with the rapid consumption habits of digital platforms without sacrificing accuracy. By placing technical content in familiar formats, the agency reduces entry barriers that once made archival materials feel inaccessible. Still, NASA acknowledges what transparency cannot do. Posting data and digitized reels does not erase the appeal of short, emotionally charged conspiracy clips. Transparency helps, but transparency alone will not defeat suspicion built on spectacle and feeling. Effective response requires more than archives, public education that frames Apollo coherently, and changes to how platforms distribute content remain essential if misinformation is to lose traction. In this sense, NASA's counteroffensive shows that evidence can be made accessible, but evidence must also be culturally legible. Beyond domestic outreach, NASA highlights the collaborative nature of lunar heritage. The agency has worked with international partners and communicators to frame Apollo within a shared global history rather than simply an American achievement. By pointing to verification from other spacefaring nations, Soviet monitoring during the Cold War, European astrophysical data, images from India and China, NASA underscores that Apollo was not validated only by the United States. The reframing emphasizes that the evidence is distributed, not monopolized, and therefore harder to dismiss as propaganda. One of the more innovative projects has been the reconstruction of Apollo records into interactive digital features distributed through streaming platforms. Mission footage, recovered from 16 reels and digitized at high resolution, is now presented with overlays of telemetry and navigation data. Users at home can move between multiple camera angles, pause descent footage, and read technical notes attached to specific frames. This reconfigures Apollo not as a static archive, but as a system of interconnected records that viewers can interrogate directly. By allowing audiences to explore and verify, NASA shifts Apollo from a story retold to a record people can test for themselves. Such projects attempt to solve a credibility paradox. The original Apollo broadcasts remain grainy and limited by the technology of the 1960s. Synthetic footage created today, by contrast, often appears smooth, colorful, and cinematic. To modern eyes, the genuine can look less persuasive than the fake. By restoring Apollo footage to higher quality and layering it with contextual data, NASA reduces the visual gap that algorithms often exploit. The immersive format reintroduces the missions to a generation accustomed to interactivity, making archival material not only trustworthy, but engaging. Even so, leadership recognizes difficulties that cannot be fully solved by content production. Viral conspiracy videos thrive precisely because they dramatize suspicion in seconds, while fact-based explanations take more time. The imbalance is structural, rooted in platform incentives rather than content choice. NASA can experiment with compact graphics, podcasts, and educator partnerships, but the larger battle lies in how audiences consume information. No matter how much material is released, credibility depends on willingness to weigh records against spectacle. The agency's current counteroffensive offers new visibility for Apollo and demonstrates that public institutions can adapt, but it does not close the question of belief. It shows that evidence can be recovered, distributed, and remade in engaging formats. It also shows, however, that evidence alone is fragile in environments where emotional impact is the coin of attention. Whether transparency anchors trust ultimately depends on how societies interpret and use the records provided. And that brings the story back to the archive itself. NASA's recent responses have made images, transcripts, and data easier to reach than ever. But not all Apollo records are newly digitized. Some materials remained classified for decades and have only recently been released. These documents, ranging from technical mission logs to intercepted foreign reports, form another layer of confirmation that has now entered public view, and they address questions conspiracy theorists have repeated for generations. Declassified documents and forgotten details. One of the most revealing developments in recent years has been the release of declassified Apollo-era documents, records that had remained locked away for decades. These materials include operational mission logs, engineering notes, astronaut transcripts once redacted in places, and even intercept reports from foreign monitoring stations. Many were classified during the Cold War, not due to secrecy about Apollo itself, but because they referenced radar capabilities, intelligence infrastructure, or signal tracking methods that governments considered sensitive at the time. Their public release now offers a more complete view of how Apollo was observed, recorded, and independently verified during those years. The technical logs provide a level of detail unlike anything the public ever saw in documentaries or newsreels. Every second of mission operations was recorded. Equipment checks, environmental readings, troubleshooting discussions, and exchanges about signal quality between astronauts and control stations on multiple continents. Engineers documented anomalies in meticulous notes, cross-referencing data across different facilities. What emerges is not the staged spectacle often imagined in conspiratorial narratives, but the ordinary, repetitive work of sustaining a complex system. The sheer quantity of transcribed dialogue and diagnostic information makes the idea of fabrication almost impossible. A staged performance would not generate a living archive of millions of words saturated with technical context, professional shorthand, and human error that reflects engineering reality. The astronauts' transcripts add texture to this record. Newly expanded releases include exchanges not highlighted in past publications, unfiltered conversations about malfunctioning sensors, instrument recalibrations, and minor frustrations. These passages sound nothing like scripted performances. They are messy, abrupt, and highly technical, dominated by acronyms and jargon understood only by trained colleagues. The effect makes Apollo feel less like a choreographed production and more like what it was: human beings managing fragile equipment in an environment far from Earth. A conspiracy looking to stage heroism would highlight only polished lines. These records instead show long stretches dominated by problem-solving under pressure. That raw authenticity undermines narratives that portray Apollo as performance. Perhaps the most decisive documents are those produced not in the United States but abroad. The Soviet Union, America's Cold War adversary, tracked Apollo closely from the ground with its own technical assets. Newly visible intercept reports summarize exact signal acquisition times, recorded Doppler shifts that marked spacecraft velocity, and telemetry captured in real time. During the 1960s, the propaganda value of revealing a U.S. hoax would have been enormous for the USSR. Yet no such revelations came. Their records instead affirm NASA's mission accounts, confirming landings as legitimate in detail too precise to dismiss. The fact that Soviet monitoring, conducted independently and under conditions of rivalry, matches the U.S. data remains one of the strongest counterarguments to claims of fabrication. Declassified intelligence files also show that Apollo was tracked across a broad international network. American ally stations in Spain, Australia, and elsewhere collected data, exchanging information continually with NASA and other partners. Lunar radar pings confirmed spacecraft distances from multiple sites. These overlapping records reveal how redundantly Apollo was observed. In such a system, where independent stations across continents received the same returns, any staged deception would have been exposed instantly. Apollo was not a closed performance, but an open-source event in which multiple nations monitored transmissions for themselves. The forgotten details themselves carry significance. Archives reveal handwritten logbooks from engineers recording fuel consumption variance minute by minute, their pages still smudged by grease and time. Tracking station reports identified disruptions caused by weather, noting the exact hours when lightning interfered. Soviet teams outlined alignment calibrations that coincided with American numbers, logged in language meant strictly for internal technical audiences rather than propaganda. Collectively, these items build an archive of ordinary professional work, practical documentation never intended to settle future conspiracies, yet powerful precisely because it was written with no audience in mind beyond other specialists on duty. And beyond the document sit three decisive lines of evidence that remain unmatched by any conspiracy claim. Apollo crews brought back 382 kilograms of lunar rock and soil, still studied in laboratories worldwide. Retroreflectors left on the moon are still struck by laser beams to measure Earth, moon distance with precision. And NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter continues to resolve images of descent modules, tracks, and hardware remaining on the surface. Together, these points demonstrate Apollo's physical reality in tactile, measurable ways impossible to replicate. When viewed against this mountain of material, the persistence of doubt becomes less about missing evidence and more about two key dynamics identified in modern research: distrust in institutions and the viral circulation of misleading narratives online. Studies emphasize that when audiences approach evidence already assuming manipulation, no amount of archival release is sufficient. More data does not resolve suspicion. It is simply reabsorbed into frameworks of disbelief. In that sense, skepticism about Apollo reflects the psychology of mistrust as much as it does the details of space history. Consider again the Soviet dimension. The USSR had no reason to protect NASA, yet its monitoring confirms what America announced publicly. Independent verification from a rival undermines claims of coordinated deception. More recent international confirmations, India's Chandrayaan and China's Chang orbiters photographing Apollo hardware on the lunar surface, extend this consistency beyond the Cold War. Each new contribution shows that evidence is not confined to American institutions, but replicated across global monitoring, rivals, and competitors. Conspiracies portraying Apollo as a single government fabrication cannot account for why adversaries, then and now, continue to publish independent confirmation. The broader lesson from these declassified documents and rediscovered details is that Apollo leaves a much denser footprint than conspiracy theories assume. It is not just grainy films and famous sound bites, but handwritten calculations, overlapping international signals, blips on radar screens, and literal samples of rock unlike any on Earth. The irony of skepticism lies in the charge that Apollo was too big an achievement to trust, when in fact it was precisely the size that makes falsification impossible. Fabricating Apollo would have required duplicate deception across Houston, Canberra, Madrid, Crimean observatories, and beyond. Each archive release makes that scale clearer. For anyone engaging the material directly, Apollo emerges as an engineering and scientific reality preserved in thousands of corroborating traces. The story is no longer held only in NASA's vaults, but distributed across declassified government files and international records. Taken together, these elements demonstrate not only how Apollo was flown, but how it was observed simultaneously by the very nations competing with the United States for global standing. If disbelief persists even in the face of such diverse corroboration, that tells us where the debate really resides, not in the evidence itself, but in the interplay between public trust, media systems, and cultural identity. And in today's landscape, those elements are influenced less by Cold War rivalries and more by new actors shaping the story of spaceflight. It is here that the focus shifts. The perception of authenticity in space is no longer dominated by grainy broadcasts or declassified transcripts, but by how modern audiences experience launches, rockets, and space travel in real time. The SpaceX effect. In 2025, much of the public conversation about space is shaped less by government missions and more by private companies. The most visible of these is SpaceX. Its launches stream live with multiple angles, rockets rising, boosters detaching, engines reigniting, and landings filmed close-up on ocean platforms. To millions of viewers, the entire sequence plays out in real time. The sight feels accessible, almost routine, in stark contrast to the distant mystery Apollo once represented. An event that was once a rare televised highlight now unfolds like a scheduled stream anyone can watch on a phone. This change alters how audiences think about space history. Apollo recordings, grainy and limited by 1960s transmission technology, now sit alongside YouTube feeds in high definition. For viewers accustomed to clarity, the older footage looks incomplete or suspiciously rough. The jump from live 4K streams to blurry black and white tape creates a mismatch that fuels questions. Some interpret that contrast as evidence against Apollo. Yet it is the product of technological difference, not deception. Research from organizations like the Reuters Institute and Pew shows that younger generations prefer short videos and feed-based news over traditional broadcasts. That preference sets expectations for what authentic looks like today. Grainy Apollo images jar against that norm, but they do not diminish the technical archive, the samples, records, and independent confirmations that establish Apollo as fact. At the same time, modern launches produce a paradox. Watching a Falcon 9 rocket lift off and return safely convinces many that human spaceflight is possible, reinforcing the idea that Apollo was achievable. If private engineers can land boosters with precision today, could the United States not have placed astronauts on the moon when vast Cold War budgets were at stake? For these audiences, SpaceX makes Apollo more believable, but others reach a different conclusion. They see the perfection of modern streams and wonder why Apollo does not resemble these feeds. Instead of strengthening belief, the comparison fuels suspicion that 1960s records conceal something. Clarity breeds confidence for some, doubt for others. This tension is amplified online. Social media highlights moments like boosters touching down on drone ships. Clips circulate with blazing soundtracks, captions, and commentary. Audiences express amazement, but side by side, algorithms often pull in videos comparing modern visuals with Apollo's blurred transmissions. The contrast becomes a performance. Conspiracy accounts seize on it, cutting together SpaceX highlights and lunar images to question why one appears cinematic and the other crude. Engagement grows not through evidence, but through juxtaposition. Questions about the gap between Apollo and the present also play into suspicion. Between 1972 and today, no new human missions returned to the lunar surface. For conspiracists, that half-century pause supplies ammunition. Why go once and stop? For those less versed in policy, the answer, budget cuts and shifting priorities, sounds thin compared to the drama of cover-up. The real explanations, politics, international tensions, cost of sustaining lunar programs, lack the narrative appeal that online theories manufacture. SpaceX's success makes the gap visible again, reminding audiences how long NASA has been absent from the moon. Viewers also notice that SpaceX rockets return for reuse, while Apollo's Saturn V boosters did not. From today's perspective, boosters splashing into the sea feels wasteful or outdated. Suspicion grows from that difference, but history provides the answer. The Saturn V was designed in the 1960s at immense speed, with priorities shaped by the Cold War race. Reusability was beyond the engineering capabilities and timelines of the era. It was cheaper and faster to discard stages after each launch than to build recovery systems. Modern designs benefit from decades of progress in computing, materials, and guidance systems. What looks odd is an artifact of historical context, not deception. Without that explanation, however, newer viewers interpret the contrast as inconsistency and fold it into hoax narratives. Still, the effect of private spaceflight remains double-edged. For as many who turn skeptical, others react with strengthened appreciation for Apollo. They watch reusable rockets perform with grace and conclude that if such feats are possible now, then a moon landing is entirely plausible decades earlier with concentrated national effort. They excuse the flaws of historic broadcasts as technological limits. The paradox is clear. Each SpaceX launch convinces some that Apollo is real while persuading others of the opposite. Live streaming itself adds to this cultural divide. SpaceX streams emphasize transparency, providing multiple angles, onboard shots, and live commentary. Viewers see every stage unfold without cuts. Apollo, by contrast, came in curated packages, with gaps between transmissions, moments lost to signal weakness, and narration shaped by government institutions. To younger viewers, authenticity seems equated with visible continuity and immediacy. Anything less feels suspect. The irony is that Apollo's transmissions were bound by the bandwidth of 1969, not secrecy. But filtered through today's expectations, those technological limits look deceptive. Trust dynamics reinforce this perception. NASA appears to skeptics as a political arm of government, prone to propaganda. SpaceX, by contrast, positions itself as a private innovator with a flair for disruption. Its identity as a company aligned with celebrity leadership makes it appear more authentic. The asymmetry is striking. Audiences assume corporate live streams are open, while historic state broadcasts appear managed. This perception ignores that both forms are carefully curated, only through different methods. Yet the reputational split shapes belief, making private rockets look more reliable than government programs, even when both are carefully documented. What results is a cultural effect that stretches beyond rockets themselves. Live coverage fuels fascination, raising confidence in human capability. But it also casts shadows backward, framing Apollo through comparisons it was never designed to survive. Viewers applaud modern achievements yet hesitate to accept older ones. Suspicion grows not because Apollo lacks documentation, but because audience expectations of evidence have shifted toward visuals that must feel immediate and unbroken. As SpaceX and other companies test vehicles aimed at Lunar and Mars missions, this effect will deepen. Each new stream reinforces public trust in private spaceflight, while Apollo remains frozen in tapes that no new broadcast can upgrade. That contrast does not erase Apollo's evidence, but reshapes how audiences interpret it. The SpaceX effect is therefore not one company's accomplishment, but a cultural reset of proof. Belief now rests not only on data or samples, but on how reality looks on-screen, how often it repeats, and how seamlessly it aligns with expectations. And in this lies the paradox. Modern successes make human exploration more believable in practice, while making older events look suspicious in form. The achievements of today help the idea of lunar travel feel natural, yet leave past evidence struggling against a new test, credibility measured by perception of media. This shift shows that interpretation of Apollo is not decided by evidence alone, but by how that evidence fits within cultural narratives of trust. Which raises the next question. If evidence exists and independent verification continues, why does suspicion still grip so many? The answer cannot be found in footage or documents alone. It lies in the psychology that drives mistrust itself, a pattern rooted less in what is seen and more in how people relate to authority, community, and belief. The psychology of modern skepticism. At its core, the psychology of modern skepticism reflects patterns that go beyond arguments about photos or records. Researchers studying conspiracism emphasize that disbelief thrives less on the absence of proof and more on the presence of doubt. To distrust the moon landings is not an isolated claim, but part of a broader posture of suspicion toward institutions of authority. For individuals already inclined to think governments obscure or manipulate information, the Apollo missions become just one more event framed through that suspicion. Rejecting official accounts feels coherent because it aligns with an existing worldview in which institutions are rarely to be trusted. Psychologists often note how cognitive biases shape this process. Confirmation bias pulls people toward material that validates their suspicion and filters out evidence to the contrary. A blurry frame showing an odd shadow may linger in memory, while hundreds of clear images providing consistency slip away. The discrepancy is not rooted in data, but in perception. People retain what strengthens the story they have already embraced. This is reinforced by algorithmic curation. Studies such as the POLES survey show that users who rely heavily on social platforms for science information are more receptive to conspiratorial framings. One video suggesting fakery often leads to dozens more, creating the impression of widespread consensus where none exists. Skepticism also becomes social identity. Online communities gather around disbelief, and in these spaces rejecting Apollo shifts meaning. It no longer functions primarily as a statement about history, but as a signal of belonging. Members express solidarity in comment threads, valuing the reinforcement of peers over the weight of technical archives. Social psychologists underline how identity group membership often outweighs factual persuasion. Once a theory is tied to community life, abandoning it feels like severing ties with people who provide affirmation. This explains why evidence that seems overwhelming to outsiders rarely persuades insiders, because the cost of shifting belief is not scientific but social. A further dynamic is the appeal of contrarianism. Dismissing Apollo provides the thrill of epistemic rebellion, the conviction of seeing what others cannot. Sociological research describes this tendency as a way to reclaim control in a world that feels dominated by remote powers. Taking a position against institutional authority can feel empowering, a means of asserting independence from official narratives. Among younger audiences especially, skepticism operates this way, as a gesture of generational autonomy. To question what one's parents saw as fact grants a sense of standing apart, a quiet defiance with its own rewards. Digital ecosystems amplify these traits. Conspiracy content is tailored for strong emotions, music choices, captions, and edits designed to spark disbelief or indignation. Cognitive studies show material that provokes emotion spreads more readily than neutral or technical explanations. The speed and repetition of this content provide what researchers call the availability heuristic. The more often an idea is encountered, the more plausible it feels. Even if a claim is weak, repeated exposure convinces viewers that it must be common belief. This repetition intertwines with confirmation bias until disbelief seems ordinary, even when the evidence against it is immense. Crucially, research underscores that belief in moon hoax theories does not stem from pathology or deficiency. Instead, conspiratorial thinking fulfills psychological needs, a sense of community, a feeling of autonomy from authority, and the comfort of a simplified story in a complicated world. The moon conspiracy, like others, reduces historical complexity into a manageable narrative with protagonists and antagonists. It feels clarifying, offering control to those who adopt it. That sense of clarity is its allure, not the details of the evidence. Surveys and experimental work point toward strategies that can reduce conspiracism's grip. Evidence-based tactics highlighted by organizations such as WHO, CARSI, and Oxford include direct refutation of false claims, pre-bunking that warns viewers how misinformation works, and basic media literacy training. Studies confirm that these approaches make audiences less vulnerable to misinformation loops, particularly when applied through the same digital spaces where conspiracy thrives. The takeaway is pragmatic. Mistrust intensifies where no countervoice is present, and declines when systematic correction accompanies community engagement. All of these factors help explain why the hoax narrative endures. It is not the lack of lunar evidence that sustains disbelief. The missions have left physical, verifiable footprints, lunar rocks distributed worldwide, reflectors that still return laser signals, artifacts photographed by multiple space agencies. What maintains the hoax narrative is the satisfaction it provides: social belonging, empowerment through defiance, and escape from the complexity of institutional records. Conspiracism survives because it produces value in these domains. When placed within this psychological framework, skepticism about Apollo appears less surprising. Belief or disbelief is not decided by the quantity of proof, but by how that proof connects with identity, trust, and meaning. Research findings suggest doubts will remain as long as institutions are perceived as distant, and as long as digital ecosystems amplify fascination over accuracy. Apollo's story persists at the intersection of abundant evidence and enduring mistrust, a paradox in which technical clarity coexists with cultural suspicion. The question then becomes wider than individual psychology. Belief patterns diverge not just within communities, but across nations. In some regions, new lunar missions strengthen public confidence by independently confirming Apollo's traces. In others, skepticism spreads despite the same evidence. This difference highlights how the psychology of trust interacts with cultural context, pointing toward how Apollo is understood well beyond the United States. International perspectives. Outside the United States, Apollo's meaning looks very different. In many countries actively pursuing their own lunar programs, the moon landings are accepted as a documented milestone. India, China, and the United Arab Emirates each use Apollo as a reference point, a historic foundation they frame as proof that human exploration is possible and worth continuing. Instead of rehearsing old doubts, these nations highlight Apollo as precedent. Their public narratives contrast sharply with the strain of skepticism circulating in Western feeds, where questioning Apollo often functions as a gesture of mistrust rather than a serious examination of evidence. India provides a clear example. In 2023, the Chandrayaan-3 mission landed near the lunar South Pole, demonstrating technical capability few nations have achieved. Its instruments confirmed lunar surface data that matched previous findings from Apollo missions, including mineral patterns aligned with rock samples returned in 1969 and 1971. Earlier orbiters, such as Chandrayaan-1 and Chandrayaan-2, had already gathered imagery revealing disturbed regolith near Apollo landing sites, soil still showing the imprint of human and machine activity half a century later. For India's scientists, these results did not serve as rebuttals to conspiracy claims. They were simply part of methodical lunar research. Yet they provide precisely what skeptics demand: independent evidence collected by a rising space power with no incentive to protect NASA's reputation. China's Chang program adds another layer. Since 2007, multiple Chang orbiters and landers have sent back high-resolution images of Apollo artifacts, descent stages, wheel tracks laid by the rovers, and instruments left on the moon's surface. These captures are straightforward, satellites recording visible objects where records said they would be. What makes them significant is context. China has every geopolitical reason to highlight rival weakness, and if there had been grounds to cast doubt on Apollo, doing so could have carried symbolic power. Instead, its missions publicly released photographs that confirmed the U.S. record. For domestic audiences, these images reinforce China's narrative of space as a field of continuous progress. For international observers, they show that Apollo's traces stand up to scrutiny by independent rivals. The United Arab Emirates has pursued more modest projects, including the Rashid rover delivered aboard a Japanese-led lander. While that mission encountered setbacks, it reflects broader regional participation in lunar exploration. For emerging programs like the UAE's, Apollo functions as an obvious benchmark, the proof of what previous generations attempted and what new spacefaring nations aim to reach. Abu Dhabi's officials often frame participation as building on humanity's established record, not revisiting whether Apollo occurred at all. For them, acknowledging Apollo strengthens aspirations of joining a lineage of exploratory achievement. These examples highlight the broader point. Independent observations exist across multiple nations and multiple missions. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, launched in 2009, has imaged every Apollo landing site in sharp detail, showing surface hardware, descent stages, and even footpaths still tracing across dust. India's Chandrayaan orbiters have confirmed disturbed regolith consistent with landings. China's Chang orbiters have cataloged artifacts and equipment in positions that match mission maps. Collectively, these datasets provide overlapping confirmation. The idea of a coordinated global cover-up spanning rival governments, decades of technology, and multiple institutions collapses under the weight of independent evidence. An additional note comes from how researchers worldwide treat this data. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter deliberately aimed its camera arrays to photograph Apollo landing zones, and the resulting images are archived openly, shared with the global scientific community. Universities, amateur astronomers, and planetary scientists outside the United States use this material for study, presentation, and outreach. The photographs are not hidden. They circulate through academic databases and educational programs. Yet while scientists interact with this evidence as routine, the images rarely cross into viral platforms where conspiracy narratives thrive. That gap between professional circulation and popular visibility helps explain why confirmations remain quiet in the spaces where doubt grows loud. From an international perspective, disbelief holds little strategic traction. In India, Apollo is folded naturally into the story of national ascent, proof that lunar landings are achievable, and that the country now stands among the nations capable of building on that foundation. For China, Apollo is treated as one chapter in a larger arc of human expansion outward, occasionally used to underscore that Western milestones are no longer singular, but part of a timeline China now extends. In both cases, Apollo is contextual rather than controversial, an anchor that reinforces present ambitions rather than a target of suspicion. What emerges is a striking divide. In the United States and parts of Western Europe, rejecting Apollo can function culturally as a performance of independence from authority. Online, suspicion is rewarded because it signals defiance of government or mainstream accounts. Abroad, suspicion does not serve that function. In India or China, dismissing Apollo offers no symbolic advantage. Instead, acknowledgement of its reality dovetails with national pride, amplifying confidence in present-day steps rather than undermining them. Where mistrust defines the domestic story, ambition shapes the global one. The essential conclusion follows clearly. Independent spacecraft have imaged the landing sites, confirmed Apollo artifacts, and verified the program's records. This evidence comes from multiple nations, including rivals. The existence of overlapping datasets makes disbelief difficult to sustain outside environments already primed for mistrust. A cross-national cover-up of such magnitude is implausible, especially when evidence is generated by governments with divergent agendas and competing ambitions. Science does not stop at borders, and neither does confirmation. And yet, within algorithmic feeds, much of this international validation fails to register. Orbital imagery of a lunar module is quiet and technical compared to a short clip, dramatizing dust clouds or shadows. The stronger the evidence, the less visibility it sometimes gains in entertainment-driven environments. The world has confirmation records in abundance, but technology now determines which parts are amplified and which remain invisible. This gap points to a deeper challenge. Evidence by itself does not decide public belief anymore. How that evidence is framed and distributed matters as much. International confirmations show that Apollo's truth is not in doubt scientifically, but the persistence of denial demonstrates how culture and media filter which facts gain power. The issue is no longer whether proof exists. It does, multiplied and corroborated, but how societies interpret, ignore, or downplay that proof in practice. At this stage, the conversation returns inevitably to education. If datasets, missions, and imagery are available yet remain overshadowed by viral repetition of misleading narratives, the question becomes practical. How can societies prepare new generations to handle this dynamic? What tools make evidence recognizable and misinformation less persuasive? These questions now confront classrooms as much as space agencies, reshaping how Apollo is taught in a world of algorithm-driven feeds. Teaching truth in the algorithm age. In schools and universities, Apollo skepticism is being treated less as a distraction and more as a teaching tool. The challenge is not convincing students that humans walked on the moon. It is giving them the skills to navigate a digital world where surface-level visuals often overwhelm solid evidence. This shift has produced a set of practical strategies aimed at showing students how truth looks when filtered through algorithms, edits, and emotional framing. In what some educators call asterisk teaching truth in the algorithm age, conspiracy content becomes raw material for building digital literacy. Teachers begin with the first tactic, helping students read the platform. That means showing how social feeds are designed primarily for engagement, not accuracy. Students watch viral Apollo hoax clips straight from TikTok or YouTube, and teachers pause at key frames to point out how the video is shaped to hold attention. Jump cuts, dramatic audio, and captions designed to provoke. They explain that algorithms reward this kind of production because it keeps people scrolling. The lesson is not about whether a flagged shadow actually proves something, but about recognizing that the platform's logic values emotional pull over factual weight. Research findings, including results from the POLES and CARSI survey groups, underline why this is critical. People who first encounter science information in these formats are more likely to absorb conspiratorial framings. The act of slowing down to analyze style before substance helps students see manipulation, not persuasion. The second tactic focuses on inoculation and refutation techniques. Show the fake, show how it's made, then compare with the archive. Teachers begin with a viral hoax segment, say, the waving flag clip, then replicate it. They reveal how digital tools or selective framing create the illusion, often letting students experiment with editing themselves. Next, they contrast that with Apollo's primary source evidence. Official mission transcripts detailing the flag's setup, high-resolution lunar reconnaissance orbiter images of the site, or historical footage that shows the full sequence without cuts. By seeing the deliberate construction of deceit side by side with authentic provenances, learners experience why authenticity rests in documentation chains, not in polished visuals. Oxford and WHO research on debunking strategies indicates that exposing audiences to weakened forms of misinformation, then dismantling them with evidence, makes people more resistant to future false claims. And unlike dismissing conspiracy videos outright, this approach arms students with the reflex to question how manipulative content gets built. The third tactic is experiential, giving students direct practice. Instructors ask them to create their own short-form conspiracy-style videos, using the same editing tricks hoax accounts deploy. They then produce a follow-up debunk explaining how their own clip misled. A student might cut together still images implying Apollo photography hides studio lights, then expose their own editing choice in a second clip. The act of building and dismantling their own argument shows firsthand how rhetoric, framing, and soundtrack affect perception. It strips conspiracy videos of their mystique by revealing the production scaffolding underneath. WHO pilot projects and CARSI Center field research underscore the value of this approach. Active, hands-on inoculation is much stronger than passive warning. Students remember the manipulation because they performed it themselves, and awareness translates into more durable skepticism across different misinformation topics. These techniques also address a broader tension in classrooms. Accuracy needs detail, while viral platforms reward simplicity. A physics teacher might spend days guiding a class through how Apollo spacecraft handled radiation shielding. Online, the same topic takes 20 seconds to distort. Rather than trying to compress an entire technical explanation into a short lecture, educators use active exercises to slow down perception. By working through misinformation themselves, students learn not only what scientific facts are true, but how misinformation exploits emotional triggers and editing choices to look convincing. The goal is not to outpace viral clips, but to inoculate viewers against being swayed by them. Universities extend these strategies in media studies. Professors assign conspiracy clips alongside journal articles, asking students to compare communication forms. The objective is not to judge true versus false. The evidence is already clear. Instead, the exercise clarifies why false material secures traction. Discussions show how repetitive slogans like "wake up" or "open your eyes" provide belonging cues inside conspiracy spaces. Hashtags and music cues are dissected alongside traditional editing choices. The benefit of this approach is that Apollo conspiracies become less about lunar geology and more about dissecting the psychology of digital communication. Students begin to see that what makes a conspiracy spread online has little to do with the substance of the claim and everything to do with how it is packaged. Informal online educators mirror this work outside classrooms. On Twitch, YouTube, or TikTok, some creators adopt the formats of conspiracy creators, only to subvert them in real time. A video might begin like a classic hoax short and then reveal the editing tricks, explaining frame by frame why the illusion works. Others host live Q&A sessions where viewers can ask about Apollo details directly. Transparency is key. When an answer is not immediately clear, creators admit it openly, contrasting sharply with the false authority of conspiracy narration. Research shows audiences value this honesty. Admissions of uncertainty build trust, whereas confident but misleading claims collapse once credibility falters. These efforts sit within a growing recognition of how online environments shape belief. Studies demonstrate that warning prompts and digital nudges improve accuracy discernment. When people receive a moment of friction, a reminder to pause and consider the reliability of content, they make more accurate judgments on average. Incorporating this idea into classrooms means teaching students to build internal pauses of their own, mental nudges that slow the reflexive share. Small interventions like labeling content or prompting fact checks may not eradicate conspiracies, but research confirms they shift behavior measurably. When extended into education, the effect compounds. Every learner gains tools for slowing instinct and weighing evidence. Pilot programs show the payoff. Students who practiced analyzing Apollo conspiracies later applied the same skills to debunk health misinformation and political manipulation. They identified cherry-picking, selective framing, and the use of emotion as markers of falsehood. Their skepticism generalized. It was not limited to spaceflight. Instead, Apollo conspiracies became a training arena, providing the first chance to confront misinformation and walk away stronger. This pattern speaks directly to education's role in the algorithm era, not to defend single historical events, but to protect the cognitive habits required for interpreting them. The symbolic weight of this shift cannot be overstated. Once, Apollo conspiracies symbolized the erosion of trust in government institutions. Today, they provide an opening to build resilience in young people who must navigate an abundance of digital manipulation. Doubt, in this framing, is not the terminus but the beginning, the raw material through which critical thinking is exercised and refined. By moving the conversation from whether humans landed on the moon to why conspiracy clips appear persuasive, Educators transform a persistent myth into a tool of defense. The broader goal extends beyond Apollo. Media literacy built around space skepticism becomes media literacy that counters anti-vaccine rhetoric or climate disinformation. The techniques are the same. Read the platform, recognize the manipulations, compare against authentic records, and practice refutation. The outcome is less about defending 1969 broadcasts and more about preparing 2025 audiences for whatever claims or deceptions appear in their feeds tomorrow. This is why educators frame Apollo as an ongoing lesson and not a settled argument. Yet even with these promising practices, questions remain. Education competes with systems designed to monetize attention, not accuracy. Documented strategies like prebunking, active refutation, and nudges can help, but they demand consistent effort. No single intervention will erase conspiracy culture. What it can do is train people to interpret evidence differently, to see all viral claims as constructed rather than self-evident. By embedding that skill in younger generations, education provides a countermeasure neither platforms nor governments have been able to enforce fully. The path forward is not about eliminating doubt, but about directing it. Skepticism should be cultivated, not suppressed, tempered into questioning that seeks verification rather than spectacle. A student taught to analyze an Apollo conspiracy video is more likely to approach other online claims with the same lens. Accuracy becomes less about memorizing facts than about developing habits of evaluation. In that frame, truth becomes learnable even under algorithms that thrive on distortion. This reframing turns the persistence of Apollo hoax theories into opportunity. Where misinformation seems strongest, the most effective response is to build resilience through use, not avoidance. And resilience, once learned, scales outward, touching not only how we see Apollo, but how societies interpret all future claims of discovery, achievement, or danger. Education here is less about the moon itself and more about the capacity to keep evidence visible in environments that blur it at speed. The next step is recognizing what is truly at stake. The question of Apollo is not only whether the landings happened. Evidence has answered that in multiple ways. The deeper problem is whether we can hold on to trust in evidence as it collides with new media systems. That tension points directly toward the broader challenge now confronting us. The story of Apollo captures a constant struggle. Overwhelming physical evidence stands firm, yet algorithms and viral clips keep reshaping how that record is perceived. Proof exists in rocks, retroreflectors, and imagery, but belief depends on how people choose to verify what they see. For viewers today, the most important step is active. Practice checking sources, demand credible confirmation, and train skepticism towards spectacle that trades clarity for clicks. What single piece of lunar evidence would make you change your mind? Tell us why in the comments, and if you found this documentary valuable, like and subscribe.